I had absolute power. If my ideal had just been to keep power, then today you'd be talking, if you were allowed to the General Secretary of the Communist Party. But that's not what I wanted.
The older ones might remember this chap, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He just turned 91 3 months ago. Almost 40 years ago, as the boss of the Soviet Union, he came up with 3 ideas, all 3 widely popular in the West, though not so much in the USSR itself. His 3 ideas were transparency, reconstruction, and acceleration. 2 of them were so popular in the West that everyone remembers them to this day by their Russian name, гласность и перестройка. This resulted in widely popular independence movements all over the USSR, some of them quite peaceful and widely televised in the West, such as those in the Baltic states, others a bit more bloody, like the one in Georgia. But it also resulted in a war in Moldova. I showed in episode 2 of this series how this played out in Chisinau, and in episode 3 how this played out in Gagauzia. Well, while Gagauzia and the North are imperfect success stories in the sense that they somehow got along now without killing each other, the Far East was less willing to come to the negotiating table. While still part of the Soviet Union, the Far East of Moldova proclaimed its independence even before the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldova overall had done so. One thing led to another, and now you have a place that is explicitly not communist but identifies with the USSR in ways that even Russia itself doesn't, and functions like a state with flag, coat of arms, anthem, its own currency, military, borders, and so on, but it's not a state. How did this happen, and how did that affect the rest of the country? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 6 of the featured series Knowing Moldova. Alright, so in this episode we'll focus on history and how Transnistria is seen from the outside, specifically from its western so-called border. In the next episode we go into Transnistria itself, and then in episode 8 we'll discuss its politics. So, whenever the topic of Transnistria is brought up, immediately this map is shown, or one similar to it. That's how you identify this place on the map. But the beginnings of this clusterfuck start with this map. Almost 100 years ago, in 1924, the Soviet Union created what you see with orange on the map, the Moldavian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, which included present-day Transnistria, as well as a few other places that are today in Ukraine. This autonomous republic had its capital at Balta, today in Odilsk district, Odessa Oblast. While the carving out of this Moldovan Autonomous Republic was implemented by the Soviet Union, it wasn't a communist policy per se, but rather traditional Russian imperialist policy, the kind of which anyone neighboring Russia had seen before, and the kind of which we can still see today, for instance in Mariupol or Kherson in the current war in Ukraine. The point of carving out Moldovan ASSR from within the Ukrainian SSR was twofold. First, to radicalize pro-Soviet feelings in Bessarabia, in 1924 part of Romania, as you can see on the map, with a view to eventually annex Moldova when more favorable conditions would emerge. And the second purpose was to create a geopolitical bridgehead. Lots of Soviet weapons were to be deployed here in order to be used later on to project influence and power in eastern Romania. Again, this was 1924. And between 1924 and 1939, this place was used to train agitators who would then get into Romania and attempt to stoke communist movements or outright commit terrorist attacks. Then comes the pact that you may have heard of, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, whose very existence was a conspiracy theory until after World War II. This pact is the one in which the German problem and the Russian problem cut a deal at the expense of the intermarium, which is what these two problems usually do. It's what they're doing right now as well. The countries most affected were Poland and Romania. Long story short, Moldova fell to the Soviet Union and became the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic, with the territory roughly the same as it is now recognized internationally. During the war, as part of the Operation Barbarossa, Romania goes beyond this river, the Dniester, and occupies not just the current territory of Transnistria, but also the former Moldovan ASSR and Odessa Oblast. The formed Transnistrian governorate didn't last, and there were also internal disputes on it, the Romanian politicians being essentially against holding it, because it was beyond Dniester and thus outside of the Romanian national ideal. More important, though, is the fact that the name Transnistria did remain in the consciousness, even after the USSR took back the whole region all the way till the Prut River. Just like in other places in Moldova, for instance, Baltic, the USSR, once it came back, it did what the USSR always did: deportations, killings, and physical replacement of people, and shutting down of churches by physical demolition oftentimes. You know, the usual Soviet stuff. But the name Transnistria remained in the consciousness long enough for it to resurface almost 50 years later. So, as said in the intro, when Mikhail Gorbachev started loosening the cultural and economic restrictions in Chisinau, the Moldovans organized and forced the Supreme Soviet of the Moldovan SSR to recognize the Romanian language and also to abolish the policy of mandatory Cyrillic. You see, in the USSR, non-Russian languages were permitted as long as they were written in Cyrillic. So you had a Romance language like Romanian written in Cyrillic. Also plenty of Turkic languages written in Cyrillic such as Kazakh and Uzbek. Well, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldova had an outright Romanian-speaking majority almost everywhere, except Gagauzia and its far east. Both in Gagauzia and in Transnistria, enough of the populace was made to believe that they will be facing severe repression because they were Russian-speaking, and if this sounds familiar in 2022, it's because Russia never changes. But while with Gagauzia a peaceful, albeit imperfect, resolution was eventually found, that did not happen here. Part of the reason is that in so-called Transnistria, the majority were Slavic peoples, so their connection with Moscow was also ethnical, not just linguistic, as it was the case with the Gagauz people. Also, the Gagauz people had been there long before the USSR was even a thing, and for them the Russian language was, and still is today, just the lingua franca to communicate with other ethnic groups. Meanwhile, in Transnistria, the people were there mostly colonists. That is to say, people brought there by the Soviet Union, at least in part for the purpose of eroding the majority. This same policy was applied in Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. By the way, and those countries still have problems to this day because of that policy. From 1975 and until 1985, the Soviet legislation had a provision that gave the right to the officers in the Soviet Army, the KGB, and other state apparatchiks to settle in a more comfortable and life-sustaining area once they were done with their military duties, if those duties were in harsh conditions, such as the North Pole or the far east of Siberia. The more comfortable and life-sustaining areas, as they were more or less Abkhazia, Crimea, and Moldova. Absolutely by no coincidence, these are also the areas subjected to this day to Russian oppression. For the 10-year period this piece of legislation was around, at least 55,000 people, all of them either Russians or monolingual Russian speakers, settled on the left bank of the Dniester River. For them and their families, this was a reward for having served the Soviet Union in harsher conditions. And they chose the left bank of Dniester because Moscow had been more careful with the economics here, building several new big factories as well as new buildings, which today look terrible, but at the time was among the best the USSR had to offer. So, in other words, there were fewer incentives for those in Transnistria to negotiate. The thing is that there wasn't much interest on the rest of Moldova either, except for economics, because a lot of industry was concentrated in Tiraspol and Râbnița. So, the Nationalist Popular Front wins the first quasi-free elections in the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldova in 1990, and precipitated by this, in September 1990, an ad hoc gathering in Tiraspol proclaims the Transnistrian Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. Mikhail Gorbachev doesn't like this, and in December 1990 annuls the proclamation by decree, insisting that a unified Moldovan SSR is what's needed. It all goes downhill after Gorbachev's forces successfully fight off an attempted coup d'etat in Moscow. This event, in August 1991, is, for good reason, seen in positive light pretty much everywhere, including in most of Moldova. Equally true, however, is that the failed coup d'etat is what started the chain of events that created the clusterfuck that is still around today. So, right after it became clear that the coup d'etat failed, the Moldovan elites figure it out that they have a clear path to secession from the USSR, so they declared their independence, and almost nobody objects, except for Tiraspol, which drafts its own declaration of independence as the Transnistrian Moldovan Socialist Republic again. A few months later, after they officially renounce socialism and the Soviet socialist part of the title is dropped since the Soviet Union itself would dissolve. Chisinau would have none of it, as it claimed sovereignty over the whole former SSR Moldova. So the Russians gathered volunteers, and since most of the Soviet ammunition inherited was already in Transnistria, used that one to start the war. That war, the Transnistrian War, legally never ended. It is, to this day, a frozen conflict. It should be noted that a blunder by the first post-Soviet president of Moldova and Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first post-Soviet president, precipitated the escalation of the conflict into a war as well. In the early 1990s, lots of negotiations were being held between the newly independent authorities and Moscow on what to do with the Soviet military equipment on the territories of the newly independent countries. Some countries, like the Baltics, outright renounced any claim to any of it and shipped it themselves to Russia. Other countries were not fast enough to make a decision. Eventually, Mircea Snegur, the Moldovan president, issues a decree saying that any military equipment on the west of Dniester now henceforth belongs to Moldova. Nobody objected, but this left open the discussion on what happens with the equipment on the east of Dniester, which included an ammunition warehouse which was, and still is today, one of the largest in Europe. So Boris Yeltsin decrees that the equipment on the east of Dniester is henceforth the property of the Russian Federation. That decision by Yeltsin precipitated things. Now, whether Yeltsin intended to start a war or involve Russia into the war or not is of little importance now. The fact remains that Russia intervened in the conflict on the side of the separatists as a result of the post-Soviet Moldovan president leaving the question open. The war itself lasted between March 2nd till July the 21st, 1992. The ceasefire agreement held to this day, and the so-called borders of the so-called Transnistrian Moldovan Republic were essentially drawn up to the positions that the Russian army was holding at the moment of the ceasefire. But, since there is no peace treaty or formal recognition of Transnistria, the western so-called border is full of honks. By the way, not even Russia itself recognizes Transnistria, even though the whole place would have long ceased to exist without Russian support. So here's one honk. This is the railway station of the city Tighina, or Bender. The city Bender is in Transnistria, even though the city is on the western bank of Dniester. But the village right next to it, Varnica, from where we tape this footage, is firmly in Moldova, even though it's a suburb of Bender. The railway station itself is de facto under the control of the separatist authorities, but de jure it was never really negotiated. That's how we were able to videotape these images and take these photos and simply ignore the military police that kept asking us to stop. Yes, in theory, you're not allowed to videotape or take pictures in the railway station, but such a rule would have to be enforced by the Moldovan police since we were taping from inside Varnica village. The Moldovan police, meanwhile, couldn't care less what we were doing here since this footage was taken on election day, so naturally law enforcement was much more busier with the protest at the polling station, which were also the much more likely places where a provocation and/or violent event could happen. Here's another honk. Beyond this railway station, there's a farmer's market just to the right of the apartment building in the picture taken by my colleague. The market is also in Moldova, but the road towards it is not. But if you go through the railway station, you can reach it, provided that you're mentally strong enough to ignore the Russians who will whine about you doing that. In fact, the separatist authorities themselves aren't, to this day, very sure about their hold on the city of Tighina or Bendir, since in their own internal organizing of Transnistria, the city is not given an official status. And it's not the only honk. Since the so-called border of Transnistria was drawn based on wherever the separatist troops happened to find themselves at that moment, the border is not smoothly on the Dniester River. For instance, this is footage from during the Transnistrian War in the village Koshnica in Dubăsar district. Following a successful defense, then, the village located on the left side of Dniester remains to this day as part of Moldova. The same is true for the village Korzhova, also in Dubăsar district. And in these places, lots of surrealist interactions with the so-called pacification forces take place. That's how the Russian forces are officially called, the pacification forces. In present day, they don't even bother hiding that they're Russian occupation forces. As you can see, they sport the Russian flag on their uniforms. Here's footage from the Moldovan TV8 station with a journalist that did in Korzhova in 2020 exactly the same as we did in Varnica in 2021.
Ну, вы нас задерживаете просто. Мы проходим.
Мы вас не задерживаем. Я вам делаю замечание, что съемка запрещена, вы камеру так и не выключили.
Хорошо, будем знать. Ну, потому что мы журналисты, мы как бы не можем выключать.
Зачем? Куда вы идете?
Зачем вы меня трогаете?
А зачем вы уходите? Я же с вами
Потому что я вам говорю, я прохожу, и мне дела с вами как бы особенно нет.
Так вы проходите через пост, съемку продолжаете. Съемка запрещена на территории поста.
Но мы на территории Республики Молдова находимся.
На территории миротворческого поста находитесь.
У нас свободная страна.
Вы находитесь на территории миротворческого поста. Вы что, настойте? Я с вами разговариваю.
На основании чего вы меня задерживаете?
А я вас пока не задерживаю.
Ну, тогда мне надо...
Я могу задержать вас на основании того, что вы снимаете на территории поста.
Тогда мне нужно просто идти дальше, понимаете?
Не обязательно, мужчина.
Вот, мы идем к полиции, идемте разберемся с полицией.
The village Korzhova is in fact divided, again de facto, because the Russians keep on poking even though the whole village is supposed to be under Moldovan control and not under separatist control. The separatists also claim Varnica as their own, which is why they harassed us, but they're not as ballsy here though. The Russian forces do that routinely in the villages that are on the contact line with Transnistria. Although, to be fair, we got pulled over by the Moldovan border patrol once when we were coming back from one of the multiple incursions on the contact line. In fact, up until election day, every time we got close to the Transnistrian line, we got pursued by a car, oftentimes officially branded as part of the Moldovan intelligence service. But, unlike the Russian pacificators, the Moldovans didn't harass us or bother us in any way. About 1,000 people died in the Transnistrian War and almost 3,000 were wounded. The TV station from which I quoted earlier has an episode from their series Beyond the Dniester dedicated to the wounded. If you speak either Romanian or Russian, I fully do encourage you to look up the series started in 2020 that continues to this day. All of their episodes are subtitled in Russian or Romanian, and they go in great detail about how life on the contact line goes on today. More recently, they also picked up wartime reporting from Ukraine. Totally worth it for the surrealist interactions. Look up Dincolo de Nistru in Romanian or Reka bez granic in Russian. The plan when we descended to Varnica was to interview the war veterans who were protesting the electoral tourism practiced by the separatists, which we did, to take blitz interviews with Transnistrian voters, which we did, and then to take interviews in Transnistria itself about the election, which we did not. We got into a lengthy argument with the Russian army at the so-called border checkpoint with the so-called Transnistrian Republic, and the best concession we got was that we would be allowed in without videotaping equipment, preferably in another day. A violent storm was slowly progressing towards the south of Moldova, so we decided to try another day. It's worth noting that the Moldovan Border Patrol never really asks you anything, which makes sense given that from the Moldovan point of view, here there is no border. So whether you head towards Transnistria or coming out of Transnistria, you will only be questioned by the Russians. Well, except for the election day when we were joyfully stopped by the Moldovan patrol as well, and when they heard it's press-related, they told us a good joke, and unless we were asking for directions, we were invited to carry on with our business. It should be noted that when asked for information, even off the record, about Transnistria, the Moldovan police is rarely well informed. For instance, they told us to just go straight ahead into Bender and there won't be any issue, and then they were genuinely shocked that the Russians didn't allow us in on the election day. Now, this situation has been going on for exactly 30 years now. In 2014, at Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, the separatist authorities required to be welcomed into Russia, but Russia forgot to answer the email. As of 2022, the calls to join Russia have been renewed. The trouble is that neither Moldova nor Ukraine would like to have a Kaliningrad between them, and de jure independence, after negotiations of some of these honks like the Bender railway station or Korsova, is vigorously opposed by the pro-Russian socialists and by the so-called pro-Western forces in Moldova, even though the argument for independence is, well, legally sound. After all, what's beyond the Dniester river never belonged to Romania or the medieval Principality of Moldova, but was rather, as I said at the beginning of the video, a maneuvering by the USSR which carved out this place from Ukrainian SSR to become a seed for future invasions. Also, in its declaration of independence, Moldova denounces the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which was, after all, well, the only document binding everything beyond the Dniester to the rest of Moldova. Integration into Ukraine is, of course, opposed by the separatists now. They might have agreed with this 25 years ago, but definitely not now. So it is, in other words, a clusterfuck. Neither here nor there. So how does it function? What is life really like in a country that doesn't exist, worshipping the hammer and sickle yet not being communists, and how do people manage things like postal services, exports, commerce with the outside world? How do people travel? All of that in the next episode when we go through this checkpoint into Bender or Tighina and Tiraspol. The Russians said we shouldn't videotape with a professional camera, but they didn't say anything about the car's dash cam. So there's that. Oh, one more thing. A bit over 300 years ago, Varnica was the site for what King Charles XII called the Second Stockholm. Yes, Carolus Rex of Sweden lived here for 4 years after having lost the Battle of Poltava, alongside his ally, the Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa, who ended up dying here. Mazepa got buried in Galați, now in Romania, where is still honored with a monument in the Liberty Park, and 2 neighborhoods in the city center bear his name. Fun fact, anything positive about Ivan Mazepa was haram in both Moldova and Ukraine throughout the Soviet period. Meanwhile, in communist Romania, the communists agreed to name 2 central neighborhoods in Galați after him, even though initially they wanted to call them Stalin. The reason I'm mentioning these things is to show that this area, the south of present-day Moldova, isn't new to big geopolitical conflict. It's been like that for over 300 years. In 1709, Varnica was right next to an Ottoman-administered citadel, just safe enough from trouble, almost always from Russians. In 2022, Varnica is right next to a Russian-administered city, just safe enough from trouble, because the more things change, the more they stay the same. And with that, I'll wrap this up by saying that the existence of these places is what motivates regular people all over the Intermarium to be so vehement in support of Ukraine, even despite previous grievances with Ukraine itself. I mean, after all, 1992 newly independent Ukraine supported Transnistria. Present-day Ukraine would do almost anything to reverse that moment of stupid in public. The current war in Ukraine could give birth to new such places, with frozen conflicts and disputed territories in peacetime, just like the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia did. In fact, Transnistria is recognized by 3 other entities: Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Artsakh. All 3 are creations by Russia on the territory of other countries. Here, on the edge of the so-called PMR, is how you learn really fast how things can go when Russia has its way. So, in the next episode, we head into the PMR and discuss its economics, its organization, demographics, and a few other aspects. And in episode 8, we'll go through its politics. And with that, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous financial support. Visit our website, and if you like what we do, consider a donation. Soon enough, we're heading to Central Asia to cover yet another area that's going through the fallout of Russia's decisions. See you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.